So today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be looking at Mr Birling. Now, Mr Birling is an essential character in An Inspector Calls, as he is the patriarch of the Birling family, and is one of the main opponents to the Inspector, and also one of the main reasons all the events happen. So what we're going to be doing is looking at Mr Birling and looking at his influence throughout the entire story. Now, one of the most important things to look at when we look at Mr Birling is to look at his appearance. Now, he's described as being a rather heavy-looking man. Now, this could be an example of J.B. Priestley showing us his views on those that were able to feed themselves and put food on the table, being perhaps gluttonous and committing a sin by enjoying all of this food and plenty that was there, whereas some people were really struggling to even put food on the table. Now, what makes this really interesting is it shows us how Priestley viewed these people as being gluttonous and greedy. Now, as well as that, he's described as being in his mid-50s. Now, the reason he's described as being in his mid-50s is it's again showing that perhaps he's going to be very set in his ways, this particular character, and that he isn't actually interested in what's going on around him. So J.B. Priestley is setting us up to see what kind of man we're going to be dealing with here, and how difficult he perhaps is going to be, or how unmoving, as he's in his mid-50s, going to be very set in his ways. And lastly, it talks about how he is he has a rather provincial accent, and this again shows that maybe he's only going to be concerned with what is going on around him in a very small location, and not actually overly interested in what's going on in the wider world around him. The way that we can infer this is, as it says, he's got a rather provincial accent. It shows that maybe he's from a small country environment or a small town environment, so he's not going to be the best person to comment on what's going on in the wider world around him. Now, leading on from him not knowing what's going on around him, perhaps, there are some examples of dramatic irony right at the start of Inspector Calls. These two quotes: "There isn't a chance of war, and the Titanic is unsinkable," absolutely unsinkable. Now, as an audience, we need to recognise the context that this play is written in. Now, this play is set in 1912, however, would have been performed from as early as 1946. So this means that those people that will be watching the very first adaptations of this play be performed would have lived through one, possibly two world wars, and the Titanic sinking would have absolutely been in recent history. So this shows that Mr Birling perhaps isn't the best person to be talking to them about current affairs or predicting the future, and both of these things come to play in this play. And it shows perhaps an ignorance of what's going on around him, or a self-confidence that because he's been successful in his life, perhaps he doesn't need to pay attention to what's going on in the world around him, and that it'll all be okay in the end. Now, the last thing that I would look at is where he says, "I'm talking now as a hard-headed businessman." Now, this is a very strange thing to be saying right at the beginning of the play, when they're celebrating his daughter's engagement to be married, where you would think that he'd be talking as a proud father, but is instead, he says he's talking as a hard-headed man of business. Now, this quote shows really what he places emphasis on and what he thinks is important, because if he was talking about his daughter's engagement and how much he's looking forward to having Gerald as part of the family and how in love they both were, then we'd be seeing him from a more human side. However, J.B. Priestley is presenting him to only be this character that cares about business, that cares about money, that cares about everything else, and doesn't actually care about what's going on with his daughter and Gerald on an emotional level, and is only looking at it as a businessman, or is looking for a chance to reinforce that this is actually what he's about, and that's what his key message is. Now, as mentioned, Mr Birling is presented more as a businessman, and we see this again in the first act when he talks about this key quote here. Now, this is a key quote that all students should be remembering. "Perhaps we may now look forward to the time when Cross and Birling are no longer competing, but are working together for lower costs and higher prices. Now, this shows several of Mr. Birling's ambitions here. As we know, Mr. Birling is a upper to higher class citizen. However, Gerald Croft is part of the aristocracy, and therefore is above Mr. Birling in terms of the social pecking order. And we see here Mr. Birling's ambitions to climb higher up the social rankings by getting his business involved with the Crofts' business, with Lord and Lady Croft's business. It also shows how this marriage is not so much a marriage for love, but is a marriage for business. It talks about how Crofts and Birling alone are competing but working together, rather than talking about how they're going to be together for the love of his daughter, and how they're going to be, a very, very happily married couple. And then it also talks about there being lower costs and higher prices. Now, this again shows J.B. Priestley's idea of what they care about here. It's not a case of they're working together to improve the lives of the workers and the little guy that are working beneath them, but more an issue about them working together for financial gain, and to line their pockets rather than helping out the little guy, helping out the workers. Now, J.B. Priestley, as a socialist, would have believed that this would have been the way to go. So again, Mr. Birling is being presented as this character that doesn't care about who he needs to tread over to get to what he wants, and sort of shown as the complete opposite to J.B. Priestley in the way that he's seen. Skipping ahead to Act 3 and looking at the way that Mr. Birling cares about his public image, he says there'll be a public scandal when the inspector leaves and they're trying to talk over what they need to do. Now, him saying there'll be a public scandal shows that he's not so much worried about the repercussions of Eva's death and the fact that a family is now without a daughter, but more about his public image and how that will be presented and how best to save it. Now, this is also shown when he finds out that the inspector perhaps wasn't a real police inspector, and he says, "By jingo, a fake." Now, this use of the expression "by jingo, a fake," and the use of punctuation here shows a surprise but also relief from Mr. Birling, and how pleased he is that all of a sudden this public scandal has gone away, because if all else fails, he's able to blame it on there being a fake, someone that perhaps got them to admit to things that they hadn't done, rather than him facing up to the actual issue at hand here and addressing the problems. He's hiding behind the fact that perhaps this was a fake or a joke. Now, one of the key themes with Mr. Birling is this idea of capitalism versus socialism. Now, these quotes here show his attitudes towards the idea of socialism. So, first one, probably a socialist or some sort of crank. Now, by describing socialists as crank, he's showing them to not be worthy of his time, and how actually he needs to be thinking about the bigger picture, and also saying that crank is someone that perhaps is insane, or perhaps doesn't have any ideas that are worthy of consideration. So immediately Mr. Birling is showing his disdain for this idea that J.B. Priestley is trying to put across. He also talks about how society shouldn't be mixed up like bees in a hive. Now, this simile is really important, because when we think of bees, we think of communal animals that all work together for the same aim, without actually any thought of themselves or any kind of mutual benefit other than to eat and live together successfully and raise their young. So this idea that he doesn't like this idea shows that he perhaps doesn't value the idea of everyone being equal and everyone working together for this common goal, which is obviously one of the core ideas of socialism, that everyone is equal and everyone works together and everyone gets a fair share of the spoils. And Mr. Birling, with this simile, is saying, actually, that's not the way that I think society should work. Equally, he talks about it being his duty to keep labour costs down. Now, obviously, with our modern take on the situation, when we think of employers, the employer has rights, but employers also have duties to uphold and make sure that they carry out for their workers. Now, at no point during this play do we hear anything to do with how Mr Birling is looking after his workers, and it is all to do with keeping labour costs down. So again, here this is showing that Mr Birling is only really concerned with his ability to make sure his factory stays profitable and make sure that he continues to earn money for the cheapest possible price, rather than being concerned about the working conditions perhaps of his factory or the lives of the working men and women that would have worked for him. So J.B. Priestley is really hammering home this message that Mr Birling sees the way that society should run very differently to the way that he believes that society should be run. Now, Mr Birling is an amazing character to look at the key themes of the play through. Now, he links to a large number of them. So, for instance, he links to the idea of capitalism. He is the complete opposite to everything that J.B. Priestley believes in. We can see that through all his discussions of business, his attitudes towards socialists, his attitudes towards the inspector, and his attitude towards taking responsibility for his actions. And he talks about how he can't be held responsible for the actions of Eva after he sacks her. He's also an amazing character to talk about for the theme of power and control. He's the head of his household. He's the head of his business. He tries to assert dominance over the inspector by saying things, well, I don't like your tone, or I played golf with the chief of police, and these things here to try and take control back off the inspector. It's also really interesting to look at how he talks to Sheila, and he tells her to run along when the inspector comes along, as it's nothing to do with her. He's asserting that power over him. He also tries to get power over people like Gerald through things like Gerald's upcoming marriage to Sheila, and talks about how he's going to get into the honours list, for example. And this leads really nicely onto class. Now, he is a higher class citizen, but he's still trying to climb these rungs of the social ladder. So he is trying to move up the ladder by talking to Gerald, and he talks to Gerald about how his name might have found its way onto the honours list, meaning that he would be knighted, which would make him part of the aristocracy and make him a social equal with Gerald and Gerald's parents, Lord and Lady Croft. He also talks about how he wants the companies to merge together so that Crofts and Birling can work together. And all of these things show that he is obsessed with class. He also talks about how she was no doubt making trouble, girls of that class, when he finds out that Eva was sacked from Millwards, when the inspector starts to interview Sheila, and these ideas such as that. He also is a really key one for responsibility. Now, he does begin to take responsibility for his actions towards the middle part of the play, especially when he finds out about Eric. But this all changes very rapidly when he finds out the inspector wasn't actually an inspector. And all of a sudden, the remorse he's felt and the fact that they have done what they've done seems to disappear, and he reverts back to this uncaring type of character. And this shows a lack of ability to take responsibility, because it isn't actually what he's done, perhaps, that makes him feel remorse for it. It is the presence of the inspector, and then as soon as the inspector is gone, he's concerned about there being a public scandal, rather than being concerned about Eva's death or Eva's family. And the last theme that he links into, that I'm just going to mention, is this idea versus public versus private. Now, Mr Birling has a public life. He's obviously a prominent businessman in the local area. He's also a very active member of the community. He talks about himself being a party man, meaning he's obviously linked to a political party in the local area. He also talks about how he was Lord Mayor and that he's a serving magistrate. So this public life is what Mr Birling is really proud of. Okay, he's seen as a real local man, a real people's person. However, as soon as this thing happens in his private life, he immediately becomes very concerned with his public appearance, and that's why he talks about things like a public scandal and this fear that his public persona might be destroyed by what the inspector is talking about is a real concern for him. So the idea of public versus private is a really key theme to try and analyse and get your head into. Now, does he ever change? Mr Birling is a real strange character for this, and it's very much up to your personal opinion. Now, he appears to change. He goes from taking zero responsibility at the beginning of the play, talking about how he cannot be held accountable for her actions after she left his employment, all the way through to beginning to take some responsibility and actually actively encouraging other characters, saying that they need to take some responsibility for their actions as well. However, towards the end of the play, when it becomes obvious that the inspector wasn't perhaps who he said he was, Mr Birling all of a sudden switches and no longer cares about the actual event and more about how his public persona has been influenced. And as soon as he finds out the inspector isn't real and that there has been no girl taken into the infirmary, he begins to celebrate along with everybody else. Well, I say everybody else. He begins to celebrate with Mrs Birling and Gerald again. So the question of does he change is very much one that you need to consider for yourself. And I believe that the easiest way for you to do this is to think about, if you were to rank order who is to blame for the death of Eva and Daisy, where would you put Mr Birling? Would you put him right at the beginning, because without him none of this would have ever started? Or would you put him somewhere else and then start to think about, does he actually genuinely feel remorse for what he's done? Or is it all a show? And actually just because the inspector's there, and the inspector is quite a presence, the fact that he knows everything, the fact that he's omniscient, the fact that he knows exactly what's going to happen before it even happens, does that presence perhaps influence Mr Birling more so than the actual event? Because at the end, when the inspector leaves, what he is more interested in is protecting his own public image and not actually about sorting out the issue at hand, which is obviously that Eva or Daisy has passed away, and he is concerned with preserving his public image. So the question of does he really change is very much one that is up for interpretation, because he starts to take some responsibility, but then decides that the best course of action is for him to in fact take none. Now, we're just going to look at some of the other key quotes here. Now, as I've already mentioned, Mr Birling says a lot of things throughout the play to do with control, to do with capitalism versus socialism, to do with class. Now, just a couple of other key quotes to think about. There's no Inspector Gould on the police force. Okay, this again shows power because he knows all of the police. Okay, and he's using this influence. And again, after he calls up the chief of police after they've after the inspector's gone to check whether there's an Inspector Gould on the police force, Mr Birling is able to make that call, once again demonstrating his power. And he says, I've told you before that I don't like your tone. And again, talking about the inspector and trying to assert control and dominance over the inspector, trying to say that actually you'll talk to me how I wish to be spoken to and not how you wish to do it. He wants to do everything on his terms and not the inspector's. Once again demonstrating this power and this assumption of class, or a superiority based on class. And then the last one to think about is this one here, where he says, nothing to do with you, Sheila, run along. Now, this again is both class and context, and tells you a lot about Mr Birling from how he speaks to those people around him. So just a few quotes for you to think about on top of the ones that we've discussed throughout this video. Now, hopefully that's all been very useful to you. If it has, please comment below, like and subscribe, and there'll be more videos of Inspectacles coming shortly. Thank you very much.